Okay, so today's video is about the doctrine or the principle of double effect. If you did GCSE RS, then this will probably be familiar to you. So the idea itself originally came from Thomas Aquinas and his book Summa Theologica. But it's been kind of like written about and applied in lots of different circumstances since, particularly in the field of kind of like medical ethics. And as I mentioned before, if you did GCSE RS, you probably came across it in relation to things like euthanasia. Okay, so the general idea behind the doctrine of double effect is that when you choose an action, it most often has more than one consequence. So sometimes actions just have one, but more often than not, any action that you choose will have multiple consequences, like choosing to eat the right food will have the consequence of you feeling happier and healthier, but it might also have the consequence of your energy levels being higher. It also might have the consequences of your skin being healthier. So you don't just kind of choose to eat the right food and only have one consequence. There are normally multiple consequences to actions. Okay, so multiple consequences to your actions. But usually when we choose an action, we don't necessarily have multiple consequences as our intentions. Normally we have kind of like one thing that we're aiming for, one sort of desirable outcome for a particular action. Like you might be choosing to eat the right food because you've noticed that your skin's getting a bit oily and you're getting a bit spotty. So that might be the intention behind you choosing to eat the right food. That's the desired outcome, the thing that you are aiming for. So the specific consequence, as it were, that you're focusing on when you're making that choice. Okay, so it's important to note that it is a decision that you're making, not because you necessarily think it's the right choice to make in and of itself. So it's not necessarily that you think, oh, eating the right thing to do. I'll try that again. Eating healthy things is always the right thing to do. In this circumstance, you're kind of choosing to eat healthy because you're trying to obtain a certain consequence with your actions, i.e., you want to reduce the fat coming out of your skin cells and the oil coming out of your skin cells, and therefore reduce the level of kind of spots and things that you have. Okay, so again, it's just an important distinction to make because you're not focusing on sort of doing the right thing for the sake of the right thing because you believe it's the right action. The rightness or wrongness isn't dependent upon kind of like the action itself in this circumstance, but it's dependent upon whether it kind of achieves the desired outcome. So you're focusing on the consequences of your action in order to make a judgment about whether it's kind of a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. One of the issues though, when we focus on kind of like the outcomes or actions, the consequences of our actions, is that as with kind of the situation here, we may well get multiple consequences, some of which will be desirable, some of which will not. So, as well as our kind of intended or desired outcomes, we might have something undesirable as an outcome of our actions too. So, it may be that by eating certain foods which are better for your skin and healthier for you, you end up kind of realizing that you have an allergy to certain types of foods that you're trying to eat in order to improve your skin, and you end up having allergic reactions to the new foods that you're introducing. Now, had you known that changing your diet in this way would cause that kind of reaction, that allergic reaction to you, and that were the only consequence, so you wouldn't necessarily have improved your skin, you just had the allergic reaction, then it's unlikely that you would have chosen that action, okay, just based on the undesirable outcome. So there are two outcomes, two consequences to your action, the one that you intend and the one that you don't intend in this circumstance. And in this circumstance, if the undesirable outcome were the only outcome that you achieved, then you wouldn't have chosen that action in the first place. So there's a double effect here, two effects. One that you're aiming for, one that is undesirable and that you don't want, and it's so undesirable, but that if it were the only outcome, then you wouldn't have chosen the action at all. So this is essentially what it means by double effect, because as we say here, there are two effects to the outcome, double just meaning two. So the one we intend, the desirable outcome, and the undesirable outcome. The idea behind this principle is that you can still say that you are acting morally and doing the right thing, even if there is a secondary undesirable outcome, as long as that first desirable outcome is still achieved. So, as long as you do still improve your skin, you can still say that you've done the right thing, even if you have this allergic reaction. Okay, it might mean that you just need to kind of change the foods that you're eating again slightly, to take into account the things that you think you might be allergic to, but you've still done the right thing, because you've still achieved the desired outcome of improving your skin. So let's look at a second example of the doctrine of double effect in action. So we're going to look at a different situation whereby you're intending one outcome with your actions, but there is a second outcome that's also created, and it's still moral because you achieve your intended original positive outcome. I guess a bit more of a serious example, like if we look at the national lockdowns and things that we've experienced recently. Okay, so we've had lots of businesses rather, various different types of industries that have been closed recently. Okay, and our desired consequence, our desired outcome in this is to bring down the rate of infection. You know, you've seen all the slogans, kind of stay home, save the NHS, save lives. Okay, that's our desired outcome that from introducing, or the government's desired outcome from introducing these lockdowns. We're trying to reduce the rate of infection and slow the spread of coronavirus. Okay, and we have indeed achieved that desired outcome by people staying at home. We have reduced the number of people that require hospitalisation because of coronavirus, and we have stopped the pressure on the NHS, therefore reducing the people that have died unnecessarily because the health service is stretched. Okay, so that's our desired outcome, and we've achieved that. What we've also had and what we've also seen is quite an increase in people experiencing mental health issues. So there's been quite a stark upturn of people feeling depressed, anxious, kind of stuck in very much less than desirable situations at home. And so that's kind of like a second or a double effect that we've had. Our undesirable effect, our undesired consequence in this circumstance is that people's mental health has suffered from not being outside, not being able to interact with their friends, family, etc. Okay, but according to the doctrine of double effect, introducing this lockdown and closing businesses, telling people to stay at home, was still the morally right thing to do, because our intended outcome of reducing the rate of infection and saving people's lives was still achieved. Okay, so even taking into account the toll that this series of lockdowns have had on people's mental health, it's still moral, still the right thing to have done to introduce the lockdown, because we still achieved our desired outcome. So that's a bit of a general overview on what the doctrine or principle, because it's referred to as both, of double effect is. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about Aquinas and his writings on the doctrine of double effect. So Aquinas makes the distinction between what he calls interior acts and exterior acts. So when he says interior, he's essentially referring to something being internal to yourself. So your interior acts are your internal kind of thought processes and intentions behind choosing a particular act. So it's the thing inside of you that makes you pick a particular action. Your feelings towards it, your intent, and your thought process. The exterior acts are the effects that it has on the world. So how does it kind of affect the lives of other people, affect your life, etc. It's the intention and the consequence, essentially. The intention, the reason behind you choosing to do something is your interior act, and then the consequence, the effect it has on the world, is the exterior act. So, according to Aquinas, in order for us to judge an action as being good, morally speaking, both the interior act and the exterior act must be good. So your intention behind doing something must be good, and the effect that it has on the world must be good. So if we look back again at the example of the lockdown, I would assume and hope that the interior act and the intention behind the government introducing the lockdown is to stop people from dying, and the exterior act, the effect on the world, was that it did indeed reduce the number of people dying from coronavirus, or dying unnecessarily because of the strain coronavirus had caused on the NHS. So, in this circumstance, Aquinas would say that that was a good thing to do, a good action, because, again, the reason for it, the intent, and the consequence were both good. The interior act and the exterior act were both good acts, and therefore overall it makes it a good thing to have done, morally speaking. And that is still taking into account the secondary exterior act. So the second effect that the action of having a national lockdown had on the country. So even taking into account the fact that it has had a detrimental effect, a negative effect on people's mental health, it still has been done for the right reasons, and it still has had the desired positive effect on the country, and therefore it's the right thing to do. Okay. Okay, so this might seem potentially at this point like it would allow some quite kind of cavalier and kind of ill thought out ideas to still be seen as acting morally. But remember, Aquinas thinks that we've got this God given ability to reason, to use right reason, and so he does think that it would still apply your need to use right reason in a situation like this in order for it to still be a moral act. So, what I mean by that is it is perfectly possible that kind of people rush into situations without applying reason accurately. They can be reckless in their actions, even if their intentions are good. They can do things which have quite negative consequences also because they haven't really thought through their actions. So, potentially a bit of a controversial example here. The easing of some of the lockdown restrictions over the summer with things like eat out to help out. Well, you would assume that the interior act there, the intention behind it, was to kind of reduce the long term impacts of lockdown, things like people's mental health being affected, things like their jobs being affected, people being affected by being at home for extended periods of time, etc. So, the intention behind, you would hope, easing those lockdown restrictions in the summer and the autumn were to reduce the long term impacts that we'd experienced so far. So, fiscal, financial, emotional, social impacts of the lockdowns, the first lockdown, I should say. And Yes, that is indeed one of the consequences that we saw. Things reopened, people went out, had a lovely time with their friends, and we did see, businesses were starting to kind of um, come away from the edge of financial ruin. We saw people feeling happier, healthier, etc., because they were able to socialise, to visit family members, to have weddings, etc. And it did indeed have the intended effect. However, arguably, it was a bit of a reckless action because it did indeed mean that the R rate, the rate of infection, went over 1, and we started to see the same effects as we had done the previous March, if not worse, looking at the number of people that were dying for coronavirus related reasons. So potentially, I mean, this is just kind of my opinion on the circumstance in essence, but you could arguably say that this here is an example of what Aquinas was referring to when kind of right reason wasn't necessarily applied to the circumstance. The government was a little bit reckless by encouraging people to go out and kind of to socialise, etc., and making people feel that things were back to normal when we didn't have at that point the test and trace in place properly, or effectively, I should say, and we didn't have at that point any the immunisations that we could actually hand out to people. And so reopening things at that point, and kind of not just reopening, but encouraging people, actively encouraging them to go out and socialise, could be seen as kind of reckless and not well thought out. And so even though the intention was good, so the interior act was good, the exterior act of kind of um, increasing people's happiness, allowing them to have social gatherings, etc., was good, but there was a recklessness to it, which meant that there was perhaps a more serious um, exterior act of um, increasing the death rate because of coronavirus. So, because of the potential negative consequences of reckless or ill thought out decisions, which have good intentions, so kind of they're good interior acts and do have some good exterior acts, um, not necessarily taking into account the amount of good exterior acts in comparison with the amount of negative exterior acts. Natural law kind of comes up with 4 conditions that should be in place when we're trying to apply the doctrine of double effect. So it's basically a way of working out whether the secondary negative effect, the secondary exterior act that's undesired, is worth the the detrimental effect it's going to have in comparison with the desired exterior act, and the desired positive consequence. So, first 2 here, you need to make sure that the act itself, the thing that you're doing itself, is not an evil act. So there are some things which are just outwardly wrong, and there isn't ever really a justification for them. So things like murder, rape, etc., they wouldn't be allowed, they wouldn't be permissible, even in the doctrine of double effect. Okay. The second thing is that the likely ratio of good to evil in the outcome must be at least equal. So that's kind of going back to what I was saying about the eat out to help out type thing. Is it likely to produce more of a good outcome than it is a bad outcome? It has to be at least equal. So there has to be at least, when you're going into choosing this action, it has to be that the outcome will be a balance of good and bad outcomes. Even if there's not more good, it has to be at least equal between the two. It can't be that the outcome is clearly going to be disproportionately bad, or that the bad outcomes are going to be greater and the good outcomes for the action. The third criteria or condition is that the act itself should be done with good intentions. So you shouldn't be kind of aiming for negative consequences when you apply the principle of double effect. You should be aiming for positive consequences. And the final one is that there must be kind of like a rational and a proportional reason for the action to take place in the first place. Okay, so by that, what I mean is that it can't just be a kind of a disproportionate or an overreaction to a situation that you're in. So if someone's kind of taking something from you, say, like taking some biscuits from the cupboard that are yours, then a proportionate reaction would be to kind of to speak to them and sort of say like, hey, stop eating my biscuits. A disproportionate action would be to, sprinkle some rat poison on the biscuits in order to poison the person because they're stealing your biscuits. That would be disproportionate. So yeah, there has to be, as I said there, a rational and a proportionate reason for the action to take place in the first place. Now, the example that Aquinas uses himself when he talks about the doctrine of double effect is self-defense. So he talks about how no, hurting people isn't obviously a positive thing to do, but if you're kind of intending, so kind of going through this criteria here, if you're the act of defending yourself in its try that again. The act of self-defense is not in and of itself an evil act. The likelihood of the outcome being good is pretty much equal or on par with the likelihood of the outcome being bad if you defend yourself when you're being attacked. You're as likely to hurt them as they are you, theoretically, all things being equal. Okay, so it's not an evil act in itself, defending yourself, and the balance of good and bad outcomes are fairly equal. If your intention when you're acting in self-defense is to literally protect yourself, not to hurt the other person, but to protect yourself, then you have a good intention. You're not trying to hurt anyone. And if someone is trying to hurt you or to kill you, then it is certainly a proportioned response for you to protect yourself and defend yourself. Okay, so self-defense is the example that Aquinas uses, and for him, killing someone in self-defense is still a morally permissible thing to do. It's a consequence that's unintended from your actions, but it is proportionate. It's not evil in and of itself to defend yourself, and the likelihood of the outcome being good is equal to being bad, and therefore, according to Aquinas and the principle of double effect, it is okay for you to kill someone in self-defense. That's not to say, and there's a bit of a distinction to make here, you aren't supposed to try to kill the person in order to defend yourself, because that would go against the idea of there being good intentions, because then you are, the act of you're trying to kill someone and that's just bad. So it's an evil act and your intentions would not be good then. But if, say, someone were coming at you, they're trying to kind of punch you and beat you to death, and you protected yourself, you put your hands up in self-defense, and in so doing you knocked the person off balance, or you pushed them away from you, and they fell, hit their head and died, then you haven't acted immorally. You've tried to defend yourself, you've given a proportionate response, and your intent isn't to cause the other person harm. The intent there is just to protect and save your life, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to try and do. Okay, whereas if someone started attacking you and you were just like got angry and went, oh, I hate you, you're a horrible person, and then attacked them in retaliation and they died, that would be different to self-defense, where you are literally trying to save your life and there could be a secondary undesired effect of the other person, the other person's life being taken as a secondary consequence.